How you doing, guys? FGA here, and a lot of people have been asking me to hurry up and do a build video of the Reverb, but I thought I'd do a build video just to show you guys how I put it all together, a couple little mods that I do to some of the components, and give you guys a little bit of an idea of how FGA does it. But let's get straight into it. So of course, what I'm going to be using is the ImpulseRC Reverb with the 5-inch arms, and going to be using the standard PDB and also the alloy hardware kit. So that's the basics of what I'm going to be using. As far as electronics and everything else, going to be using a KISS V2 flight controller, and going to be using a KISS 32 amp ESCs. Motors, going to be using the Rotor Riot hype trains, the original 2400, 2450. I lose track. What are they? 20. I'm getting old. I can't read it. They're about 2400 anyway. And I'm going to be putting some HQ 5 by 4.5 by 3 props on there. As far as the FPV camera, going to be using a Foxia Predator, my favorite camera at the moment. The only modifications I do to it is I'm going to be putting a GoPro 2.5mm lens on there. I still have quite a few of the GoPro Session 5, so I'm going to be putting a Session 5 mount on there from Brain 3D, but if you use one of the other ones, there are other mounts that you can put on there as well. As far as receivers are concerned, I'm going to be using a FrSky X4R receiver in there. Still love the X4R. I've got a whole heap of these guys, and I'll show you how I've modded these ones as well. And also I will be using a Tramp VTX along with a Spironet antenna. And that's it pretty much for the hardware. As far as everything else, I mean, over here I've got a general assortment of tools. So I've got like wire strippers, I've got pliers, I've got little, you've got quite tweezers and scissors and hex drivers. I've got electrical tape, double-sided foam tape, and the good old classic TS100 soldering iron, which I can't do without. The other thing that I've also got is some 5-minute epoxy, and I'll show you where I use this on the ESCs, just a little mod to make the KISS 32 amps a little bit more durable from my experience. Oh, one other thing that we've got here is I've got some wire, so I've got some 18 gauge wire for powering the ESCs, and I've got some multicolored 28/30 gauge wire for things like signal lines. So there's other things like heat shrink and so forth, but that's the basics of what I've got there. So let's get stuck into putting this together. Okay, so in the main 2 packs you'll have, of course, your arm set, and this is everything that comes in the main set itself. So you've got your split bottom plate, your top plate, your camera mounts, your foam pad, your antenna mounts, your antennas, and your files. I generally find that the quality of the cutting of these guys here is good enough that I don't even bother finishing off and rounding off the surfaces. I used to do that because I didn't want things like tape or battery straps to get cut, but the quality of the machining on here is that good that it's not a sharp edge anymore, and it doesn't bother me. So these are really good if you're ever having to do some repairs or any sort of personalized finishing. But for me, I just put them off to one side and I don't even bother about them. We've got the antennas themselves, which we're going to be cutting to length. I don't normally keep them this long, but we'll put these off to one side as well, and also the antenna little clamps themselves. So I'll put them off to one side, and we'll get stuck into putting the main frame together itself. So what we're going to need is camera plates can go off to one side, along with the foam battery pad, and we'll just get the arms and the split bottom plates together, as well as we'll start pouring all of these assortment of hardware out. Now what we're going to want here is we're going to want the arm bolts and the little blind nuts, whatever you want to call them. I can never remember what they're actually called. Like blind nuts? I was going to say rib nuts. They're not rib nuts. They're cool nonetheless. So we'll get them out there. We need 8, 2, 4, 6, 7. And then we want our arm bolts. So particularly in the alloy pack, you'll be able to see you'll have 4 steel bolts, which are those guys there, and 4 alloy bolts. The 4 alloy bolts are slightly longer than the steel bolts. And if you've got the basic steel pack, it's exactly the same length, it's just that they'll all be steel. And so the arm ones, the steel ones, sorry, go on the outside, and the alloy bolts go on the inside. You can also see we've got 2 plates here. The bottom one is a bit thicker and the top one is a bit thinner, and the top one has also got some slightly enlarged holes for these little press nuts to go in there. Press nuts, I think that's what they're called. Now, Impulse actually supplies you with some hardware in here. A very short bolt, like so, and an extra washer to install these press nuts. And the way that you go about doing that is to get this extra short steel bolt that's an extra one, with the washer, and all you need to do now is just go ahead and tighten it up until it seats properly, and once it's seated properly then you can go ahead and do the rest. Now, me personally, I don't actually bother with doing that. I just assemble it all and tighten it up. But if you wanted to do it the ImpulseRC recommended way, that is the way of doing it, and it does work quite well. So I will show you how I go about doing it. Just put a bolt through there. Gotta make sure you got the right one. And put the arm over. You got to make sure that the orientation of the arm, because there is a wrong way and a right way to put it on. You'll know if it's the wrong way because nothing will fit, and you'll get frustrated and get really annoyed and say that this kit doesn't actually go together well. It's usually the first sign that you're not putting it together correctly. But I just lay it on top like so, and just gently put on the press nut, and then just keep on doing these one at a time. And just put them on finger tight, and you can see what I'm doing here. I just get this all started, and then once it's all together, then I nip it up from underneath. And as always, make sure that you have got the right length bolt. Right, so now we can see that she is all done up. It's all just done up hand tight. So now all I need to do is just go and cinch this up, and you'll see that when it's tightened up, that in here, this little part, there's a little bit of a void here which will all get pressed in, and then those press nuts will stay in there. And you can feel when it's seated right, because it just stops. Alright, so now we can see all of those little press nuts are nice and flat, and you can see the longer ones are in the middle because that's where the standoffs are going to go. So next up is the PDB. PDB is very, very simple. All you have is some double-sided tape on the back here, which comes with the kit. Put the double-sided tape on the back there and then stick it down. Doesn't seem like much, but with that double-sided tape, it is not going anywhere, and it works extremely well. Next up, we're going to prepare the KISS 32 amp ESCs, and that's just a simple matter of just preparing each one of the places, like tinning all the joints that we're going to be using, so all the motor wires, power wires, signal wires. But I'm also going to be just modifying the ESC a little bit for durability. So the top side of the ESC is generally a pretty robust. The FETs don't tend to get knocked around by prop strikes. But there is a whole heap of, like, I don't know, there's something like 20 of those little tiny little caps on the top there, which do tend to, when they get hit by a prop strike, can get knocked off. So I'll show you one of the little modifications that I make to the ESCs to make those caps a little bit stronger. Just be warned that I don't know whether Flyduino recommends this or whether they will honor any warranty claims or anything like that. If you do it, it's all on your own, but it's worked for me and I haven't had any of these caps break off since doing this. We'll start off just by tinning each one of these points. So your 2 power wires, signal, telemetry, and ground. Let's go on to modifying this a little bit to protect the caps. So all you're going to need is some masking tape, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask off the whole top except for the caps. This is just to protect the rest of the ESC from getting epoxy where you don't really want it. And we can see there that the ESC, with the exception of the caps, is now completely covered. And I'll go ahead and do that to the rest of them. Alright, so the next step is just to mix up a little bit of epoxy. So 5-minute epoxy is all you need. The way that I mix it up and the way that I apply it is with a little toothpick. And toothpick is good because it allows you to do fine work. So all I've got is just a bit of scrap, bit of cardboard. And that should be enough. You don't need a lot. Important thing with epoxy is to ensure that it has been thoroughly mixed. And then once it's mixed through, just apply a small drop along the entire length of the caps, making sure that the epoxy gets in all the gaps. And what that will do is that'll turn all of those caps into one solid piece and make them a lot stronger. Because what usually happens is the ones on the sides, the ones that get knocked off only, and all the other ones are fine. So doing this basically strengthens the whole lot. With them all done, it's just a matter of putting them off to one side and just leave them for, I don't know, 20 minutes or so to cure. While they are curing, I'm going to get some of my 18 gauge wire and I'm going to cut that to length so that I've got long enough pieces to then solder to the ESCs. And as well as that, I've got my multicolored wire. You don't even need to use multicolored wire, but I'm just an old-fashioned kind of guy. I've got blue, yellow and green for my signal ground, and also for my telemetry. So once those guys are the epoxy has cured, we can take the tape off and then we will get stuck into soldering the wires on. Okay, so it's been about 20 minutes now and the epoxy is cured enough to handle, and I've also cut the wires to length and also soldered them onto the ESC. So if we have a close look there, you'll see along those caps, you'll see it's all nice and shiny in one big glob there, and that is all nice and fully protected there, so it works quite well. And of course I've got the power wires on the side, 18 gauge wire, and I've also got some 28 gauge wire going along there. This is long enough so that when it goes on the arm, it misses all the bolts and so forth here, and sort of sits in the middle of the arm. It's not too long that it's going to be too close to the motor, but just sits nice and perfectly. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to solder these to the power pads on the PDB, and once they're soldered on there, then I will cut these little 28 gauge signal wires to the length required for those little 3 pads inside there. So I'll get stuck into doing that. Right, so that's the power wires done. So all I'm going to do now is just lay out the signal wires and just cut them off with side cutters to the correct length. So I'll go around there and just measure them, because all these pads, like the middle pad is a little bit longer than the other two, so you just need to make sure that they're slightly oversized. But you certainly don't want them so that they are too short. And I'm just going to go around and do all four sides. Of course, now we just need to take off a bit of wire sheath and tin each one of these guys. Just a small amount, doesn't need to be much. Alright, that's them sorted. So now we need to solder them on. This is where these little plier, the little tweezers come in real handy, because it allows you to get into these little corners. You can just grab each individual wire and place it there rather accurately. I like these things. They're kind of indispensable in my mind for in a quad kit. And you can see with like good preparation and tools and technique that actually soldering it all on is a very, very quick and painless process. Next up on the list of things to do is to get the XT60 battery cable soldered on. So of course I'm going to be going off the right hand side, and the XT60 itself is already pre-tinned and already cut to length. It's actually staggered, it's supposed to be like that. But what I will do is I will go ahead and re-tin this, because I never trust what kind of solder is on that, whether it's lead free or not. So I just want to re-tin it and flush it. And then it's just a simple matter of placing over the top. And there we have the battery lead soldered. So what we'll do while we're on the side of the battery is to grab ourselves a small zip tie, and when you're using zip ties, make sure you use good quality ones. The cheap ones break really easily, but if you use good quality zip ties, you can use these tiny ones and it's not a problem. So there's a little tiny slot that is in the split bottom plate, which you can put the zip tie around and through, and that is there for strain relief, so that if you do eject the battery, you're not ripping pads off the PDB or trying to rip the PDB off its mount. So now that is all sorted, what we want to do now is get into our Tramp VTX and get the power cable, and that is our power cable there. And all we're going to do is just cut off this little JST connector and strip the ends of the wires and tin them. Now that they are tinned, I'm going to go ahead and solder to those back two pads. And that is our Tramp powering setup complete. So now what we want to do is we want to go through and find our, these are these little rubber vibration dampeners for the flight controllers. We'll just attach them. They don't have to be gorilla tight, but just make sure that they're not going anywhere. Tighten them up appropriately. While we're in there, through our pile of hardware, you can go and find this. There'll be 4 nylon nuts to hold on the flight controller. So we'll just get them ready. So now we've got the KISS flight controller, and the only pads that we need to worry about soldering is these three here with the holes in them, and that larger one. So this is your receiver signal wire. Then we've got your 5-volt wire, and then we've got the ground wire. This is also the telemetry wire back to the receiver. So this one's not being set up with an OSD, so I'm going to be sending telemetry back to my Tyrannus and getting all of my information through radio, audio warnings and so forth. So before we install the flight controller, we're going to solder the receiver to the flight controller. And this is my trusty X4R receiver. It's pretty much bone stock, but what I've done, if we have a look close up, you'll see that I have decased it and I have depinned it. And on this one as well, I've actually removed the little connector on the side there as well, and just hardwired the telemetry wire, which is the green wire going through there, and the S-port wire. And then all I've done is just put some heat shrink around it, and it's the size of like an XSR. It's small enough for what I need to do in here, and it's the only receiver that I've ever used that I really trust in the FrSky range. So all I've got to do now is get these wires here and solder them to the flight controller. So we've got power, we've got ground, we've got signal, and we've got telemetry. So I'll go ahead and get these, prepare these wires and solder them onto the flight controller. And then we have our signal, power, ground, and telemetry wires all soldered up. So now we can spin that underneath like so. Let's get this in shot. And it's going to go like so. What we will do is we've now got our wires here for connecting to the flight controller. There's actually two wires here. One of these comes with just bare ends, bare soldered ends. This is if you are hooking up a flight controller other than a KISS flight controller, so you can connect it up there and still disconnect it, and so forth. But what I'm going to be using is this one here, which is designed for the KISS V1 and V2. We'll work with both of those guys, and all you do is just plug that in so, like that. And then you want to make sure that you get these the right way around. If you get them the wrong way around, then you will be letting smoke out of things. So just fair warning there. But it's pretty simple to remember. The one that with only two wires goes up the front. So this is the front of the flight controller with the arrow, goes up the front, and the one that the black wires that has a lot of wires goes down the back. And you can see how they all fit in like that. And I just fold them underneath like that. And on it goes, nice and simple. Since we've already got them, we can get our 4 nylon nuts and just install them. And these guys do, I don't bother using a drive or anything. I just put them finger tight, because you're only going to damage them if you put them too tight. And there's enough resistance there that if you put them finger tight, they're not going anywhere anyway. And all we do down the back here for the receiver is get a little bit of double-sided foam tape, cut off enough to sit on the bottom of that, and stick it down. Make sure these antennas are out of the way. Just want to make sure that it's out of the way of the holes for the standoff, so when we put them in later on. Next up is to get the camera. All I'm going to do is change the lens out to a GoPro lens, remove the stock lens, put the GoPro 2.5mm lens in there, and then we can connect it up to the side plates or the K-brackets. And here we have the camera installed inside of it. You can just see it's got a little bit of a bracket which you add inside here, which comes with the camera kit, because this is a mini camera and this mount takes a normal size camera. And then we've just got our 2 bolts in the side here. If you're going to be using something, for example, say like a Runcam Eagle that has that separate back plate, then you've also got this part here which you can attach the bolt to as well. So this will take any of your standard size cameras and be able to adjust them to suit. So all I've done is I've just put those bolts in loosely for now, and we can tighten it all up once the quad is fully together. Right, so one thing that does differ a little bit is the connector that's on the tramp for the camera suits the Runcam style of camera, and as you can see, the camera connector in the Foxeer camera is a bigger connector. Now if you want to put a Foxeer style connector on there, more than welcome to do that, but I find, and the order of the connections is fine, it's the same type of connector, just a smaller type of connector, that if you put this all the way off to one side and you have it in the right direction, that not only does it fit and go in, but it actually works. There is the possibility of connecting that the wrong way around or in the wrong order, so if you're worried about that, then I would go ahead and swap out with the proper connector. But that's how I do this on this setup, and I've never had a problem with it. You've just got to be a little bit more careful how you connect the connector itself. Now all we need to do is slot in these K-bracket camera mounts into each side. And now we can move on to the top plate and mounting the VTX. So let's put this off to one side. So first step with the top plate is to open her up and put the foam pad on. There's a couple little bits in the middle that you just need to remove, and then it's just a matter of taking the backing off and sticking it down. It just goes down the back here like so, only goes one way. Just take your time, make sure it's all lined up, and then press it on. And then you're done. So now we can spin this around and install the tramp and the Spironet. Right, so installing this is pretty simple. All you need is 2 small zip ties, some double-sided tape, and your Spironet and your tramp, which is pretty simple. Got these little nut and washer on there. I just usually take that off. And one other thing that I would recommend that you do, I like to put some heat shrink over this, because this is going to be touching the carbon fiber, and because this is a grounding point. You could have a grounding issue through the frame. You could have noise issues and so forth. So I like to put this together and cover it with heat shrink, which is what I will do now. There we go. When doing something like this up, it's always important that you do the connection up tight enough. So I like to use some pliers or something like that, just to make sure that it's nipped up to a decent tension. That way you know it's not going to come undone again. And then once that's done up, we can just slide this heat shrink back over and shrink it back down. And I'm going to keep this NFC tag connected there, because I like to use the one system that's available with the tramp for ease of changing channels, and you don't have to switch on. So I'll show you later on where I connect that up. To actually put this on the top plate, all we need to do is cut off a little bit of foam tape, and you'll probably need a couple of layers depending on how thick the tape is. This is quite thin tape, and why I've got 4 layers and I've only got that down there in the corner will become apparent soon enough. What we've got here is, if we put this on here, you'll see that this is far too long. So what I like to do is put a little bit of put a little loop in there, which helps with strain relief and things getting knocked. So all we do is I twist this around like so, and you'll see that there is a loop in that, like so. And all I do is I line up the SMA connector with that bit of a wire, that bit of a flat spot there, and then the Tramp VTX goes, the connectors go just behind this point here, so like so. And then we have the zip ties. We have one zip tie on the actual SMA connector itself. And the next one a little bit further along, so they connect up like so. And just do them up loosely so that it's all sort of lined up. And then go ahead and tighten those guys up. Stretch them out a little bit with the pliers, and then just cut the excess off. Now if you really wanted to make something really sturdy, you could put a third one around here, but I generally find that 2 is more than enough. And what you'll see is that this is a very sturdy mount, like so. It's not going anywhere, and if it gets knocked, it's not a problem. And you've got all this loop here, which is giving strain relief to the little UFL connection there. And this is also on foam padding, so it's going to take any of the shocks extremely well. And I personally have never had a UFL connection get removed from any VTX that I've ever had. I think it comes down to just having good strain relief. The UFL is only going to come undone if it gets yanked. And in that situation, the only way that's going to get yanked is if these 2 zip ties break. These are good quality zip ties, and they're not going to break in a hurry. And if I really wanted to be sure, I could put a third one on there, but even 2 by itself is perfectly fine for me and not an issue at all. So there's a reason why there is a gap through here. If you have a look here, that's where the front strap goes through. So I don't want the strap going over the top of this pigtail or the Tramp or anything like that. I want it to go in between, so that way when the battery is nice and tight, the strap is not affecting the any of this area here. The back strap goes over the SMA like that, but this is all hard and tightly put down, so it's not an issue. So that is that part all done and dusted. So all we need to do now is to connect this to the body. Okay, so now we need to attach the standoffs. So the front 2 standoffs and the middle standoff behind the camera are 30mm. Then we've got 25mm at the very back, and the ones back here are something like 10mm. They're the really short ones. But all we're going to be attaching them with is, on the bottom, these square head bolts at the bottom, which is all very simple. So we'll go ahead and grab each one that we need. So the long ones up the front. The singular standoff at the back here requires these steel bolts to go through there. They're required because otherwise, in a big hit, you might have the alloy bolt has a tendency to shear, so the one at the back there is still steel for that reason. And then we go to the back, which is the 25. And then we've got these little shorty ones to go in between. So we can see here that we've got all these guys here are alloy bolts, but this one here in the middle is still a steel bolt. So we'll just nip these guys up so that they're reasonably tight. Once again, they don't need to be super tight, just so that they're not going anywhere. We'll tighten them up a little bit more later on. Then next we want to get our antenna mounts, and these come out like so. These have a left and a right. A little bit of fidgeting, you'll find out which way is which. Basically so that when they sit on the side, they sit on the side like so, and the antennas go diagonally backwards. The interesting thing about these antenna mounts is that with no bolt in there, these slide in and out. As soon as you put a bolt through there, it locks these antennas in place so they can't be pulled out, which is kind of cool, I reckon. But first what we want to do is we want to cut these guys to length. So I don't like that the full length is way too long, but that's just the length that they come in. So I'm going to cut these guys to length, which will be, and I usually just eyeball this. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. Something about like 2/3 the length is perfectly fine. And then all we do is we go over and we find these long button head bolts and just put them through like so. And then get these guys and just put these through so the antenna, it's just sticking out just a little bit. And do the same on this side. And now all we're going to do is we're going to put that bolt through there and basically just thread it on, which is going to lock that in place. So that's fairly locked now. And we'll put this on the other side, and they only go on one side. If you put it on the wrong side, the antennas will be going forward rather than backwards. So it's pretty easy to tell when you go the wrong way. So just tighten that up by hand, and now those things are in, and the antennas are not coming out. They're nice and solid. Right, so the top plate is all prepared now, and all we need to do is attach the NFC tag. So all I'm going to do is just disconnect the connection on that side, and I'm just going to double-sided tape it right there. In the kit with the tramp actually comes some double-sided tape. Just attach this right about there. So you can see the way that it goes there. And we can just reconnect that. And you get in the hole. And that's just going to go through that little gap like that. So it's not going to get all crunched. So lastly, all we need to do is just feed these antennas through these antenna tubes. And then put the top on. And we also can't forget, got to connect up the power for the VTX. So now whenever you want to disconnect this, or you want to take the top off, it's very easy. Just slide out the antennas, disconnect the two wires to the VTX, and you can completely remove the top plate so that it's free to work on and easy to work on. And that's the reason why I do it that way. Now when we put this in, we're just going to make sure that we don't squash any of these wires. Especially around that middle standoff, there is the possibility of squashing a wire there, so just got to be a little bit careful. And that's all on. Now we just need to usually start off by tightening these guys down, and they should go through the antenna holder and then straight into the standoff below it. And tighten these up so that they're tight. They don't need to be uber tight because those plastic connections, they're nice and strong, but I mean, wouldn't wrench them down like like it's some sort of rare earth metal or anything like that. And we'll just make sure that nothing is catching. Now on the back here, you can use these shorter cap head screws. And these cap head screws in the back here are important. That way you don't put dents in your batteries if you over strap them, or they get pushed into the frame from a crash and so forth. Right, so next we want to install the Session 5 mount, and we've got a nice long steel screw, which I like to use on the back because you want to use a steel screw for the center standoff. And I've got some spare like longer alloy screws which I like to use on the front, little cap head screws, rather than the stock standard shorter ones. These will just bite in a little bit better. The only thing that you do need to make sure that you use is at the front you want to use 2 of these washers, which are supplied to give extra surface area on the grip of the bolts at the front. And on the back you want to use one of these cone washers on the very back. You'll notice that in my build I haven't put any cone washers on the bottom there. There's cone washers that are supplied for all of the bottom sections for the arms, but I don't use them. They don't really seem to do anything for me, but if you want to put them on, go right ahead. But important that you use the cone washer on the back here. And if we have a look there, we can see there's the cone washer on there. That really is just to increase the surface area, like the washers, these flat washers on the front here, to go there, and just stops the mount from being ripped out in a really bad crash. With those on the front and back and tightened up to a decent amount, I'm yet to have one be ripped out since I started doing that. Washer over that, and then that goes through like so. So there we go, we've got the washers on both of them and the cone washer down the back. So now we can just place that on and tighten it up. And that's the camera mount and body all sorted. While we're here, let's look at putting on the battery straps. So like I mentioned before, if we bring this up, you'll see that there is a gap right there, and that's where the front strap goes, and then the back strap just goes around underneath the SMA. So let's push that through. If we bring that up now, you can see that the strap goes in between the VTX and the antenna and all that sort of stuff and the top plate. That way there is no damage to that in any kind of an impact. And then the back one just goes completely around the top plate and SMA, and that's not a problem if that's in between it. And if we have a look there, we can see what that looks like. So that's the body pretty much sorted. Right, so the final step is to mount these motors and solder them to the ESCs, put the heat shrink over and so forth, so we'll get stuck into that. First thing I'm going to do is I've got some, this is sort of like rubberized foam with the sticky back on it. You could use double-sided tape if you wanted to as well, like a double-sided foam tape, and only take the tape off one side. But what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to cut these up in small squares, and I'm going to stick them to the arms where they go just underneath the ESCs. And what that's going to do is that's going to protect the base of the ESCs if they ever get a bit of a whack, so they don't, there's components that don't get ripped off off the arm and so forth. So I'm just going to cut out some squares. It'll be about the right size, 4 of them, and then just put them underneath the ESCs themselves. And all you need to do is place this under the ESC on each arm. Okay, now we want to cut out some heat shrink. I don't even know the dimensions of this heat shrink. It's only slightly wider. It's like a perfect size, slightly wider than the KISS 32 amp ESCs. So I'm going to cut something that's ever so slightly longer than the ESC itself. So that way it overhangs a little bit and creates a little bit of strain relief for the wires connected to the ESC. And then of course we want 4 of these. And it's always a smart idea to put these on early. The number of times that I have put together a quad and completely forgot about putting on the heat shrink before I soldered everything together, I don't want to think how many times that has been. It has been far too many times. And now we can bolt the motors on. Now me personally, I just use 2 alloy bolts per motor. Some people prefer 4, some people prefer 2, some prefer alloy, some prefer steel. The choice is totally up to you. There is no wrong, there is no right. For me, however, the only times that I have ever sheared motors off with bolts getting sheared off, the motor would have been stuffed anyway, so didn't really see the point in putting in 4. That said, I'm not doing this to save weight, I'm doing this because I am lazy. And it's worked fine for me this entire time. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the excuse that I'm going to use. But like I said, if you want to use 4, go right ahead and use 4. So now we've got our motors on there, and now we just need to cut these to length. So I just used the side cutters to cut them to the length that we need to, ever so slightly cut them over length. So I usually cut them to the start of the fets rather than the pad. That gives you a little bit more wiggle room. You don't want it to be awfully tight. You want to have a little bit of extra room there in case you need it. And it's good for movement and so forth. Now I just need to remove a little bit of the silicone sheath and tin these guys. Of course, you don't have to use something like this, but I find a wire stripper, a dedicated wire stripper, to be, I wouldn't say indispensable, but makes life just a heck of a lot easier in this kind of situation. Okay. Now we get our little tweezers again, our indispensable tweezers. This will be nothing new to anyone who is familiar with soldering, but if you're kind of new to it, you'll notice that the soldering itself is like the final stage of the soldering. It's very quick, No mucking about. That's the way that it should be. It all comes down to good preparation, good technique, and using good tools. The preparation takes far longer than the actual finishing part of the work. And that is all of the motors soldered up. So last thing we need to do is to slide the heat shrink into place, and then we can just shrink that down with our heat gun. So last thing to do is a bit of electrical tape around the ESCs. This is something that I have done for years. It's such a simple way of mounting the ESCs. So I put them around the FETs, and what they do is the electrical tape holds it down, but if it gets hit by something, there's still enough movement there and give that it's not going to damage the ESC. And in a worst case scenario, the electrical tape snaps and gives it even more give. And there we have the arms just covered in electrical tape to hold down the ESCs. Simple yet effective. One last thing to do. Get our props on there. And that is my version of the ImpulseRC Reverb build, and it's basically, that's exactly how I've been building every single one since like the final prototype started coming in, and works really well for me. That's pretty much it. I hope this build helped you guys. I gotta go and set this up now, and in future videos what I want to cover is setup of the KISS flow controller, flashing of that and the ESCs, and the setup and the basic sort of PIDs onto stuff that I use, and also another one setting up the Tyrannus radio with all of the audio warnings, since I don't run an OSD in this. On top of that, I will also be bringing out a video very soon showing how to set up the new Reverb OSD, PDB and so forth, because that's coming out very shortly. But yeah, for the moment, I really hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will catch you soon. Ciao guys, thanks.